Hello, my name is Florence, and I am a student of English. I want to tell you about my journey, how I learned English in just 5 months. It hasn't been easy, but it's been one of the most exciting things I've ever done. I hope my story can inspire you to start your own English learning journey. Imagine being able to speak in English fluently in just 5 months. It's not a dream. It can be your reality too. Florence's first step: finding the right motivation. When I first started learning English, it felt like stepping into a completely new world. I had never truly paid attention to how important English was until I realized how much it could open up for me. I grew up in a small town where almost everyone spoke my native language. I wasn't surrounded by English speakers, and I didn't feel the need to learn it in school beyond the basics. But deep down, I always knew there was something missing. I would watch movies in English, and although I could understand some of the words, I had to rely on subtitles. I was always curious about how people from different countries could communicate so effortlessly in a language that wasn't even their first language. I wanted that fluency. I wanted to feel the confidence to speak without thinking twice. It was one night, sitting in front of the TV, that I had an epiphany. As I watched yet another film in English, I realized how much I wanted to be able to understand everything without waiting for the subtitles to catch up. I wasn't just fascinated by the movie itself, but by the fact that the actors could switch from one language to another so easily. That's when I made a decision that changed everything for me. I would learn English. However, as soon as I made that decision, I quickly ran into a problem. I didn't know where to start. There were so many different methods, books, apps, and websites offering help, but none of them seemed to fit me. I wasn't interested in the traditional classroom approach, sitting through grammar lessons and trying to memorize words. I needed something more personal, something that would actually excite me and keep me motivated to continue. That was my first challenge. I had to figure out how to stay motivated for the long run. The first thing I did was write down the reasons why I wanted to learn English. I wanted to be able to travel the world, meet new people, and connect with them in a way that went beyond the usual tourist conversations. I wanted to understand music lyrics, movies, and books in their original language, without missing the meaning. But most of all, I wanted to feel free in a world where English was everywhere. I began to imagine what it would be like to walk into a cafe in another country, order my coffee in perfect English, and have the barista respond without any confusion. That thought alone was enough to ignite a fire inside me. The motivation was clear now. I was not just learning a language for the sake of it. I was learning it to change my life, to open up new opportunities. But even with that motivation, the journey still felt daunting. How was I going to make time in my busy life for something as challenging as learning a new language? And what if I failed? What if I wasn't good enough? These questions haunted me at first. But then, I remembered a quote I had read: "The only way to fail is to stop trying." So, I decided that my first step would be to commit to learning, even if it was just a little bit every day. The beginning wasn't easy, and there were moments when I felt discouraged. Some days, I would listen to a podcast in English and feel like I wasn't understanding anything. Other days, I would try speaking to myself in English and fumble over simple words. But the key was persistence. Every time I stumbled, I told myself, "This is part of the process. This is how I learn." Gradually, I started to see small changes. I began to recognize words I had never noticed before, and I could catch more phrases when watching movies. Slowly, but surely, I was making progress. The most important part of this step, though, was realizing that motivation wasn't something that could be forced or controlled. It was something that had to come from within. It had to be something that was connected to my personal goals, my dreams, and my desires. Once I understood that, everything fell into place. I stopped focusing on how difficult it seemed, and instead, I focused on how exciting the journey could be. I would celebrate small wins. understanding a word in a song, getting through an entire English podcast without feeling lost, or watching an entire episode of a show and laughing at the jokes without needing subtitles. Those small victories kept me going. As I moved forward, I also realized that motivation alone wasn't enough. I had to create habits and routines that would support my learning. I needed a plan, a structure that would guide me through the process. I didn't want to just learn a few words here and there. I wanted to become fluent, and to do that, I had to take action every single day. That's when I decided to dedicate at least 30 minutes a day to English, whether it was reading, listening, or speaking. I knew that even though it was a small amount of time, it would add up in the long run. Motivation, however, is like a fuel. It can get you started, but it won't keep you going unless you have something to keep you on track. And that's when the next part of my journey started, surrounding myself with English everywhere. Little did I know that the next step would be even more important than the first. But with my motivation firmly in place, I was ready to tackle it too, surrounding myself with English everywhere. After finding the motivation that truly drove me to learn English, the next step was to surround myself with the language at all times. Motivation alone wasn't going to get me to fluency. I needed to immerse myself in English so much that it became a part of my daily life. I remember vividly the moment when I realized that the key to improving my language skills was not just through lessons, but by living and breathing the language. At first, I wasn't sure where to begin. The idea of surrounding myself with English was so vast, so all-encompassing, that it felt like a daunting task. Should I read more? Should I speak more? Should I listen to more podcasts? I quickly realized that the answer was all of the above. In order to truly immerse myself, I would have to incorporate English into every part of my life, no matter how small. The first change I made was switching the language on my phone to English. It might sound simple, but it was one of the most powerful moves I made. At first, it was strange, seeing everything in English, even the settings and notifications. But over time, I started to pick up on common phrases that I hadn't noticed before. Suddenly, I was learning new words every time I checked my phone, just by reading my messages or browsing social media. But I knew that reading simple words on my phone wasn't going to be enough. I needed to expose myself to English in a variety of ways. One of the easiest and most enjoyable methods I found was watching movies and TV shows in English. I had always loved watching movies, but I had always relied on subtitles to help me understand. This time, I decided to watch without them. At first, I had no idea what was going on most of the time. The conversations felt too fast, the accents too hard to understand. But I was determined. I watched the same movie or show over and over, listening carefully to how words were pronounced and trying to pick up new phrases each time. One of the most helpful techniques I used was to start with shows or movies I was already familiar with. This way, I could focus more on the language than the plot. I would watch an episode of my favorite show in English, and if there was a phrase I didn't understand, I would pause and look it up. Slowly, my listening skills began to improve. I could catch more and more words and phrases without needing subtitles. There was something about hearing English in a natural context without a textbook that made it come to life for me. Another important step was listening to English outside of movies and TV shows. I found that podcasts were an excellent way to improve my language skills. I started listening to English podcasts during my daily routines, while cooking, cleaning, or even walking to the store. The great thing about podcasts is that they come in so many different topics, from news to storytelling, to learning tips. This helped me expand my vocabulary in different areas. I would listen to podcasts that were both interesting and educational, and I would pause them when I heard something I didn't understand, jotting down new words or phrases to look up later. But it wasn't just about hearing the language. I also wanted to speak more. That's when I decided to use every opportunity to practice my speaking skills. I started by talking to myself. I know it sounds strange, but speaking to myself in English became a critical part of my daily routine. I would talk to myself in the mirror, describing what I was doing, asking myself questions, or making up short dialogues. This helped me feel less self-conscious about making mistakes, and I began to notice improvements in my pronunciation and fluency. The more I spoke, the more comfortable I felt. I started to realize that it wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about practicing and being consistent. There were also times when I felt frustrated, especially when I could understand English when I heard it. But when it came time to speak, I stumbled over words. The gap between my listening skills and speaking skills was bigger than I had anticipated. But I didn't let this discourage me. I remembered the advice I had read earlier. The more you speak, the more you improve. So, I made a habit of speaking aloud every day, even if it was just for a few minutes. And it worked. Slowly, my words came more easily, and I found myself speaking more confidently, even in difficult situations. But even as I spoke more and more, I knew that listening and speaking weren't enough on their own. I had to read more, too. One of the simplest and most enjoyable ways I found to immerse myself in English was by reading books, blogs, and articles in English. At first, I started with children's books and simple articles, but as my reading skills improved, I challenged myself. With longer novels and more complex texts, I would highlight new words and phrases and look them up later. I also made a habit of reading aloud. This helped me with pronunciation and also reinforced what I had learned. I remember the first time I read an entire book in English without needing to constantly check the dictionary. It was a small achievement, but it felt huge. It showed me how far I had come. I wasn't just reading English anymore. I was understanding it, feeling the rhythm of the language, and connecting with the characters and stories on a deeper level. The more I read, the more my vocabulary expanded. I started noticing patterns in sentence structure and word usage, which helped me sound more natural when I spoke. But the key to surrounding myself with English wasn't just about passive activities, like watching or listening. It was about engaging with the language actively. That's when I began writing more in English. I started by keeping a daily journal in English, describing my day, my thoughts, and my feelings. Writing helped me organize my thoughts in English and express myself more clearly. I also joined online communities and forums where I could interact with others in English. Whether it was through social media, online groups, or language exchange apps, I found ways to practice writing and communicating with real people. One of the most exciting parts of this journey was when I started making friends who spoke English. I met people from all over the world, and even though we were from different countries, we could communicate in English. It was like the world had opened up to me in a way it never had before. I practiced speaking with them regularly, and each conversation helped me become more confident in my abilities. The beauty of connecting with people in English was that it wasn't just about learning grammar or vocabulary. It was about building relationships and sharing experiences. Through all of this, I began to see how powerful it was to surround myself with English. The more I exposed myself to the language, the more natural it became. It wasn't just something I studied. It was something I lived. I learned words and phrases in context, picked up slang and expressions, and gradually became more fluent. I was no longer just memorizing vocabulary from a textbook. I was engaging with English in real, meaningful ways. As I continued to immerse myself in English, I began to notice something incredible. My listening and speaking skills were improving faster than I had expected. I was catching words and phrases that I had once missed. I was responding more quickly in conversations. And most importantly, I was no longer afraid to speak. The fear that had once held me back was disappearing, and in its place was a sense of excitement and confidence. Looking back, I realize how crucial this step was in my journey. Surrounding myself with English every single day made it feel less like studying and more like living. It turned English into something familiar, something that was always with me, and the more I practiced, the easier it became to speak naturally, without hesitation. With English now surrounding me at all times, I was ready for the next phase of my journey, speaking with confidence. I had the foundation, the vocabulary, and the listening skills, but I still needed to push myself to speak more in real-life situations. That's when I took the next step. But first, I had to deal with the nervousness and fear that still lingered. Speaking even. When I was nervous by this point in my journey, I had surrounded myself with English in every possible way. My listening and reading skills had improved drastically, and I was comfortable with the language when I encountered it in books, TV shows, or podcasts. I could understand conversations better, pick up on subtle nuances in speech, and even identify slang or idiomatic expressions. I was doing well. Yet, despite all of this progress, there was one area where I still struggled: speaking. I had learned so much, but I couldn't shake the feeling of nervousness whenever I had to speak English. It was like a wall I couldn't get past. Every time I thought about having a conversation, my heart would race, and I would feel a lump in my throat. I would think of 100 possible mistakes I could make, and suddenly, speaking felt like a terrifying challenge. Even though I knew I had improved so much, the fear of speaking in front of others was overwhelming. I knew that to truly master English, I had to face this fear head-on. It wasn't enough to just understand the language or read it well. I had to speak. I had to push myself to talk, even if I was scared. This was going to be one of the hardest parts of my journey, but I was determined. If I wanted to become fluent, I couldn't let fear hold me back any longer. The first time I really confronted my fear was during a language exchange with a new friend I met online. We had been chatting through text for a few weeks, and although our conversations were easy in writing, I knew that speaking in real time would be an entirely different challenge. When we finally agreed to speak on the phone, I was a bundle of nerves. My palms were sweaty, and my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. But I had made a commitment to myself, and I wasn't going to back down. When the call started, I was so nervous that my mind went blank. I struggled to remember the simplest words. I could feel the silence stretch out awkwardly between us as I tried to piece together sentences in my head. I was embarrassed and frustrated with myself. But then something shifted. I remembered that mistakes were normal, that they were part of the process. I didn't have to be perfect. I just needed to try. So I took a deep breath and spoke again, slower this time. I gave myself permission to make mistakes. To my surprise, the conversation wasn't as bad as I had imagined. Sure, I stumbled over words, but my friend was patient. She didn't judge me or correct me harshly. Instead, she smiled and encouraged me, letting me know that it was okay to take my time. The more we spoke, the more comfortable I became. Slowly, the nervousness began to melt away. By the end of the call, I was proud of myself. Not because I spoke perfectly, but because I had faced my fear and kept going. That was a pivotal moment in my learning journey. It taught me that speaking English was not about being perfect. It was about being brave enough to try. But it wasn't easy. Even after that first conversation, the nerves didn't completely disappear. Every time I had to speak in English, whether it was with a friend or a stranger, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. But I didn't let it stop me. One of the 5 key strategies I used to keep speaking was setting small, manageable goals. Rather than thinking of the whole process of speaking fluently, I focused on small steps. I told myself that I didn't have to speak for an hour. If I could speak for just 5 minutes without worrying too much, that was progress. And slowly, over time, these small victories added up. For example, when I went out to run errands, I would try speaking to the cashier in English. I would greet them with hello or ask simple questions like, "How are you?" or "Could I get a bag, please?" At first, these simple exchanges felt like huge challenges, but as I kept practicing, I became more comfortable. Every time I spoke English, it felt a little less intimidating. At home, I began incorporating English into more aspects of my daily life. While cooking, I would talk to myself in English, describing what I was doing. Now I'm cutting the onions, adding some salt, stirring the soup. When I walked around my neighborhood, I would practice speaking aloud, pretending I was explaining something to someone. I found that speaking out loud, even when no one was around, helped build my confidence. It was like creating a safe space where I could practice without the pressure of judgment. Despite these little victories, the fear didn't disappear overnight. It was still there every time I had to speak in front of someone new. But I learned to embrace the discomfort. I realized that the more nervous I felt, the more important it was to speak anyway. I started to see my nerves as a sign that I was pushing myself to grow. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when I joined an English-speaking group. The idea of speaking in front of a group was terrifying, but I pushed myself to attend. I remember walking into the room for the first time, feeling the butterflies in my stomach. There were people there from all over the world, all of us trying to improve our English. I felt out of place, unsure of my abilities, and I was scared to speak in front of everyone. But I didn't back out. When it was my turn to speak, I felt my heart racing, my palms sweating. I started speaking slowly, nervously. I knew my grammar wasn't perfect, and I stumbled over a few words. But I kept going, reminding myself that I didn't need to be perfect. And when I finished, the group applauded. They didn't care that I made mistakes. They cared that I was trying. That experience changed everything. For the first time, I felt proud of my efforts. I realized that everyone in the group had their own struggles with speaking, and no one was judging me. The support I felt from the group made me understand that making mistakes was okay. It was all part of the process. The more I spoke in front of others, the more my confidence grew. In the weeks that followed, I continued to push myself to speak as much as possible. I didn't just practice with friends. I started speaking with strangers. I made it a habit to initiate conversations in English whenever I could. If I saw someone at a cafe or in the park, I would strike up a conversation in English. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes I still felt nervous. But the more I practiced, the more comfortable I became. I began to see that speaking wasn't as terrifying as I had once thought. The fear was only in my mind. The more I pushed through my nerves, the more fluent I became. It was like a snowball effect. The more I practiced speaking, the easier it became to speak without hesitation. I started to sound more natural, and the fear of making mistakes didn't bother me as much. I was no longer afraid of saying the wrong thing. I was focused on expressing myself, connecting with others, and enjoying the experience. But as much as I had grown in my speaking skills, there was still one thing that I struggled with: making mistakes. Even though I had learned to embrace my mistakes as part of the process, I still had moments where I felt embarrassed. I would replay a conversation in my mind, worrying about how I sounded, or focusing on a word I had mispronounced. The important thing was that I didn't let these moments hold me back. I reminded myself that learning a language is a journey, and it was okay to make mistakes along the way. What mattered was that I was speaking, that I was trying, and that I was growing. And that's when it hit me. The only way to truly overcome the fear of speaking was to speak more. So, I did. I kept practicing, speaking even when I was nervous, and gradually, that fear began to fade away. Learning with a friend. After overcoming my nervousness and pushing myself to speak, even when I felt terrified, I realized that there was one more piece of the puzzle missing in my journey to fluency: having someone to practice with regularly. Up until that point, I had been mostly learning and practicing on my own. Sure, I had spoken with strangers and joined a few groups, but there was something special about having a friend who could join me in this journey and share the experience with me. It became clear to me that learning with a friend was not only fun, but also incredibly effective. There was something about having someone by your side who understood your struggles and was working through the same challenges that made the process feel less daunting. I had always heard that language learning was easier when you had a companion to share the process with, but now I was about to find out just how true that was. I didn't have to look far for my language learning partner. One day, while I was in my English class, I met a classmate named Mia. We were both in the same beginner-level class, and we often worked on assignments together. One day, after class, we started talking about how we were both trying to improve our English outside of school. We shared our experiences of watching English movies, listening to podcasts, and reading books, but we both agreed that speaking was still the hardest part for us. That's when Mia suggested something that changed everything. Why don't we start meeting once a week to practice speaking English together? We can talk about whatever comes to mind, movies, books, or even just our day-to-day lives. It will be a fun way to practice, and we'll be able to help each other along the way. Immediately loved the idea. Having a regular partner to practice with would make me more accountable and give me a safe space to practice without the fear of making mistakes in front of strangers. It was the perfect solution. We agreed to meet every Saturday afternoon in a local cafe, a place that had always been a favorite of mine for studying. The environment was relaxed, and there was a certain comfort in knowing that no one would judge us if we struggled with the language. Our first meeting was a bit awkward. We both walked into the cafe, sat down with our coffee, and immediately felt the pressure of speaking in English for an hour straight. We started with simple small talk, asking each other questions like, "How was your week?" or "What did you do last weekend?" But even these simple questions felt like challenges. We both stumbled over words and struggled to find the right answers. The silence between us was awkward at times, and I could feel the familiar nervousness creeping in. But we both smiled, shrugged, and agreed that it was okay to make mistakes. It was all part of the process. As the weeks passed, things started to get easier. Mia and I slowly got more comfortable with each other, and the conversations began to flow more naturally. We'd talk about everything: our families, our favorite foods, the books we were reading, and the movies we had watched. At first, our conversations were basic and full of pauses as we tried to think of the right words. But as time went on, our confidence grew. We started using more complex sentences and experimented with new vocabulary. What was once awkward and difficult now felt like an enjoyable challenge. One of the best parts of learning with Mia was that we held each other accountable. If one of us didn't understand something, we would stop, explain it, and keep going. If we made a mistake, we didn't laugh or feel embarrassed. Instead, we would help each other correct it. If I struggled with a particular word, Mia would write it down for me and use it in sentences so I could practice saying it. If Mia couldn't find the right word, I would offer suggestions or help her work through it. It was a partnership where we both benefited from each other's knowledge and support. We also started making learning fun. Instead of just talking, we created games to help us learn new vocabulary. For example, we would each write down a list of words we had learned during the week and quiz each other on their meanings. We also began watching English TV shows together and pausing to discuss what was happening in the scene, how the characters were speaking, and the vocabulary they were using. These little activities made learning feel less like a chore and more like a fun, interactive experience. Mia and I also started recording ourselves speaking. At first, this felt awkward and unnatural. Listening to myself speaking English was something I had avoided up until that point. But Mia convinced me that it was an important exercise. She told me that it would help us both identify areas where we could improve, and it would give us a chance to hear our own progress over time. We began recording short conversations, where we would discuss our day, our goals for learning English, or even review what we had learned during the week. At the end of each session, we would listen to the recordings and point out things that we could do better. Listening to ourselves was an eye-opening experience. I realized that I had a tendency to speak too quickly or slur my words together, making it harder for people to understand me. Mia, on the other hand, had a slight accent that sometimes made her pronunciation difficult to catch. By listening to ourselves, we both discovered new ways to improve our speaking and pronunciation. We became more self-aware of our speech patterns and worked on fixing the small mistakes that had previously gone unnoticed. One of the most impactful things about learning with Mia was that we began to build a genuine friendship outside of our language sessions. We would meet up for coffee even when we didn't have a study session planned, simply to talk and spend time together. Speaking English was no longer something we had to force ourselves to do. It became something we enjoyed. We laughed together, joked in English, and even started to use it in situations outside of our practice sessions. Whenever we met new people, we would challenge each other to speak in English. It was like our own secret code, and it made us feel connected, in a way that went beyond just the language. As we got closer, we started making plans to travel together. We both dreamed of visiting an English-speaking country and putting our skills to the test in real-life situations. This became a new motivation for us. Knowing that we were both working toward the same goal made the process even more exciting. We began planning our trip, looking for places to visit, and practicing practical English phrases we would need while traveling. It was an experience that we both knew would push us even further in our language learning journey. As the months passed, I realized that learning with Mia had transformed my approach to speaking English. What had once been a terrifying challenge had now become a source of joy and excitement. I was no longer afraid to speak, and I felt more confident in my abilities. Mia had been the perfect language partner, not only because she was patient and supportive, but also because she pushed me to be better. We celebrated each other's progress, and our learning journey had become something that was shared, making the challenges feel less overwhelming. Looking back on those months, I realized just how important it was to have someone by my side. Learning with a friend made the process feel less isolating. We could share our fears, celebrate our victories, and learn from each other's mistakes. Our friendship became a source of motivation, and together, we made progress that neither of us could have achieved alone. Now, as I reflect on how far I've come, I know that it was the support and encouragement of Mia that made all the difference. She was more than just a study partner. She was a true friend who helped me believe in myself when I doubted my abilities. And as I continue to learn and improve my English, I know that having a partner like Mia was one of the best decisions I made on this journey. Using English in everyday life. As I sat with Mia in our favorite cafe one sunny afternoon, sipping coffee and chatting about our recent adventures, it occurred to me that my journey to fluency had shifted in a way that I hadn't fully expected. The process of learning English, which initially felt like something separate from my everyday life, had slowly woven itself into the fabric of my routine. I wasn't just learning English in a classroom or during our study sessions. I was using it in the little moments of my day, without even thinking about it. It felt like a natural progression. In the beginning, I had started learning English with a lot of structure. I used textbooks, attended classes, and followed a clear path to improve my vocabulary, grammar, and speaking skills. But now, I was starting to realize that the real challenge wasn't just about learning the language. It was about integrating it into my daily life and using it in real situations. At first, using English outside of class was a bit intimidating. I had gotten used to practicing in a controlled environment, where I could ask questions or get help whenever I needed it. But when it came to speaking English in everyday situations, like ordering food at a restaurant or chatting with people, I didn't know. It felt like stepping into unknown territory. There was a level of vulnerability that came with using English in the real world. I was no longer just learning for the sake of learning. I was applying it in moments that mattered. But just like with everything else in my journey, the more I practiced, the more I realized that the key to fluency was using English in real-life scenarios. One of the first things I did to make this happen was to incorporate English into my daily routine. I started by labeling things around my apartment with English words. I wrote the names of objects on sticky notes and placed them around the house, on the refrigerator, the bathroom mirror, and the closet door. Every time I passed by one of those labels, I would say the word aloud. It felt strange at first, but soon it became a habit. I was constantly reminding myself of words and phrases, and it helped me think in English throughout the day. Another thing I did was listen to English audio content while I went about my daily activities. Whether I was cooking dinner, cleaning, or walking to the bus stop, I made it a point to listen to podcasts, audiobooks, or songs in English. The more I immersed myself in the language, the more natural it became to think in English without even realizing it. One morning, while I was grocery shopping, I had a breakthrough moment that made me realize how much my efforts were paying off. As I was searching for the right ingredients for a recipe, I overheard two women talking in English. I had never spoken to them before, but I had heard them in the store a few times. This time, as I stood in the aisle, I decided to take a chance. I turned to them and asked, "Excuse me, do you know where I can find the flour?" They both looked at me, and without missing a beat, one of them responded in perfect English, "Oh, it's on the next aisle near the sugar." I was surprised by how quickly the words had come out of my mouth. I didn't hesitate, and there was no nervousness in my voice. I had simply spoken English as if it were second nature. It was a small interaction, but it meant so much to me. In that moment, I realized that using English in everyday situations wasn't just about grammar or vocabulary, it was about confidence. I had stopped thinking of English as something I had to learn, and started treating it as something I could simply use. It was at this point that I began actively seeking out situations where I could use English. I would try to speak with my friends in English, even if they weren't learning the language. I made a habit of greeting people in English, starting simple conversations and practicing new phrases. The more I used English, the more natural it felt to switch between languages throughout the day. I also made a conscious effort to interact with English-speaking people in my community. I found local events and groups where English was spoken, and I joined them. There was a weekly English-speaking club at the library, and I began attending their meetups. The first few times I felt nervous, but as I got more comfortable with the group, I started participating in discussions and sharing my thoughts in English. The other members of the group were supportive, and they encouraged me to speak freely, making it a judgment-free zone where everyone was there to learn and improve together. At work, I began using English whenever I could. There were a few colleagues who spoke English fluently, and I started speaking with them in English during breaks or lunch. Although my work environment was predominantly non-English speaking, I found that using English in these smaller, informal settings helped me practice in a way that felt comfortable. Sometimes I'd even offer to translate for others, which pushed me to expand my vocabulary and think on my feet. One of the most rewarding experiences was when I had the opportunity to travel abroad with Mia. We had been talking about it for months, dreaming of going to an English-speaking country to see how our skills would hold up in real-life situations. When the time finally came, I couldn't believe how much my English had improved. We traveled to London, and I quickly realized that I was able to navigate the city, communicate with locals, and enjoy the experience without feeling lost in translation. I could order food, ask for directions, and even have casual conversations with people on the street. It was an incredible feeling to realize that I had reached a point where English wasn't something I just studied anymore. It was something I could live and breathe every day. The trip also taught me something invaluable. Fluency isn't just about speaking correctly, it's about feeling at ease in the language, allowing yourself to make mistakes, and embracing the process of learning in real time. I made plenty of mistakes during the trip, but instead of feeling embarrassed, I learned from them. Every mistake was an opportunity to grow, and each conversation, no matter how small, was a chance to improve. When I returned home from my trip, I found that my approach to learning English had fundamentally changed. I no longer saw English as a separate part of my life. It had become intertwined with my everyday experiences, from the conversations I had with friends, to the movies I watched, to the books I read. I was no longer learning English in the traditional sense. I was living it. Reflecting on my entire journey, I realized that the key to fluency was not just about learning grammar rules or memorizing vocabulary. It was about using English in real-life situations. Every time I spoke, whether it was ordering coffee at a cafe or chatting with a stranger on the street, I was reinforcing my skills and building my confidence. Language wasn't something to study in isolation. It was something to be experienced and enjoyed in everyday life. And so, as I continued to practice and immerse myself in English, I discovered that it wasn't just the knowledge of words and grammar that mattered. It was the ability to communicate freely, confidently, and naturally. Using English in my everyday life had made me realize that fluency was not an end goal, but an ongoing journey. And as long as I kept using the language, I knew I would continue to grow.